Fashion is inherently political, and clothing can be used either in subtle or very loud ways to make statements, as have been done through countless subcultural movements, political movements, and I think no time like the present.
As we step out of lockdown and periods of isolation, we cast the athleisure wear aside and we step into a moment of fashion that celebrates colour and joy. It's time to express ourselves. It's time to be seen. I'm Madeline Park, stylist and vintage fashion hound. My podcast, Style Stories, explores identity through the lens of individual style, but I want to know the bigger story. What happens when we wear our Australian identity on our sleeves? Why do we often associate this with bright colours, kitsch motives, and camp codes of conduct? What does this say about who we are and how we represent ourselves? I sat down with a bunch of creative voices to help me understand the story behind the colours of camp in Australia.
After the pandemic, when we were all at home, people like to go out and dress up, and we want to be joyous and get out and get out of our tracksuits. I bought a tracksuit. I can't believe I bought a tracksuit.
People always want to go and find the thing that brings them the most joy and brings them the most nostalgia.
I feel like looking like this is the only way I can possibly deliver my music, and I feel like it helps drive home the reality of whatever my personality is.
When we think about the history of colourful camp style in Australia, we often associate it with an Australiana aesthetic attributed to the likes of Linda Jackson and Jenny Key. If the last 2 years spent at home was a chance to reflect inwards, I guess this really was the starting point of our fashion industry looking inwards for inspiration rather than turning to Paris or London for style guidance. I want to know why then, and what was the inspiration?
Having such a forward-thinking Prime Minister as Gough, who really fostered the arts. For him the arts were incredibly important. So there were a lot of opportunities to bring cultures together. What was happening here with the Australiana, I really will just keep that with more Linda and Jenny. They brought all their style and worldliness and substance and very good taste really to that, what could have been very garish fashion, but there was elements of the Australian nature in everything they did, just really embracing the beauty and the uniqueness of our culture here. What influenced me was just the absolute beauty and exuberance and the uplift of those magnificent colours and textures and things that they used.
So, if the inspiration behind this repopularised Australiana was a colourful pride in the natural beauty of our country, why do we associate this same colour and exuberance with a different type of pride?
So I think fashion historically has always been both a reflection of change and an agent for change. In that way, that's a mirror of the world that fashion is existing and being created in, and then in other ways, fashion itself creates new worlds. For me, being camp is making a political statement with dress, clothing, affectation, physical movement, speech, which toys with, I suppose, conservative understandings of gender and pushes the expectations and boundaries of conservative culture. I think aspects of the queer and camp community love that. They find the flashy, showy part of that really well aligned to queer expression. For me, I am more interested in elegance and softness and power in control as part of my personal self-expression. And so for me, the bombastic, loud colour, despite how I look, is not my reference point for expression.
Quite often, certain creatives have been less visible in history due to their queer identity. But I'm curious about why, in contrast, Australian identity, when it's performed on a greater stage, is often queer and often camp, and why that's been so popular.
I think Priscilla's popular overseas because it shows up that whole Australian over-the-top camp. And I think it's because it is so camp and so kitsch and so crazy that it worked overseas and it must be interesting. There's a colour too, a colour palette that often goes with Australian costuming. It's bright, it's sunshine, it's blue sky, it's open, very sort of crazy and a bit outrageous at times, and a bit anti-establishment also sometimes, bit naughty. Any form of fashion, whatever you're wearing. You know, dancers come into rehearsal in leotards and tight things. It's a performance. Getting dressed in the morning, it's a performance. Having your hair done, you know, it is a costume or a piece of drag, whatever you're wearing, and it says something about yourself and how you present to the world.
So if dressing up or performing drag might be a wink to a certain naughtiness or irreverence that's come to define us, what does performing drag mean to a drag queen?
But for me, it's really just all about expressing the most fully realized, authentic version of me. And that just happens to be ultra glamorous. I think drag loves to dissect that. Drag always loves to dissect the most interesting part of a story. And in Australia, and Australian identity in particular, I think that comes from our visual imagery of what unites us as a country. It's about our quirks. It's about the things that no one else in the world has. It's about the things that as a culture we collectively kind of have an inside joke about. And I think when, you know, a drag queen dresses up as the Sydney Opera House, we're kind of laughing at the idea that the Sydney Opera House is the height of glamour, you know? There's something about it that's like, oh, I'm dressing up as the Opera House. There's nothing really that glamorous about the Opera House if you live in Sydney. You're like, oh, there it is. I'm catching the ferry to Manly. It's been here for years. But when you dress it up in drag, everyone's like, oh, I know that. That's funny.
While the first definitions of camp associated with homosexuality and effeminacy, today it arguably extends beyond queer culture when we're talking about Australian identity. So what does it mean now?
Do I think being camp is being queer? Look, I think that these things do go together beautifully. But I think the queer world now is really diverse, and people, just like in any other part of society, are just free to be themselves. My definition of camp would be fabulosity, maybe people, things, objects that are loud, that demand attention, that are maybe frivolous and silly, funny, colourful, and maybe not too serious. I think that the Australiana camp connection comes from a sense, like a self-deprecation, a sense of humour that Australians have. You know, maybe it's a particular different flavour to the sort of camp that you would see in London or in other parts of the world. So, yeah, it's an embracing of those maybe once daggy Australian things, and yeah, it's embracing it and making it fabulous and being proud.
What does this style look like for the next generation? And does our highly visual culture today demand exuberance and exaggeration?
At its core is rebellious, especially in Australia's very laid back and chill lifestyle where people typically don't push their bounds as much as I would like. I do think it's kind of like an FU to the normal structures of fashion and what you might see in like the windows at your local Westfield or something. Look, I think we are young, and regardless of being on the internet or not, we're all just experimenting with ourselves, and that means our style too, right? We make some questionable choices, and that is okay. But now the main difference is that sometimes, yes, it is being broadcast to thousands of people. And I think that's fine. And I think definitely like other generations would have gone through a similar thing, but now it's just this heightened audience that we are performing to. And I think that potential like over performative or like really pushing the boundaries with our choices is just a part of that. Like, imagine if we didn't have Instagram, if we didn't have TikTok, like what would we be wearing? So I do think that people are rediscovering, perhaps for the first time, like 80s nostalgia, especially in the Australian scene, and that it is really invigorating and it does fully fit into that like vintage scene where it's a lot about color, it's a lot about kind of flamboyancy and a lot about experimentation. So yeah, I can definitely see that resonating.
If there's a certain rebellion or reach for the extreme that define our style, how do we move away from what now feels like nostalgic stereotypes and continue to push the boundaries? Where in the future might we find the quotation mark or the wink that makes camp camp?
I know what you're looking at right now on your screens is completely ridiculous, but I'm serious. Fashion is performative to me because it is literally part of the message I'm delivering alongside my music. I put myself in this uncomfortable position with my ears sheathed and my waist snatched to create this fantasy that helps propel the cinematic and emotional message of what my art does. The message that I hope my art transmits to my public is joy, hope, glamour, play, fun, escapism, and the kind of feeling that you have when you're alone in your room, no one's watching, but at the same time you're truly seen.
There's a certain irreverence or self-deprecating wit that's come to define us. But when we talk about the politics of camp identity, it's a serious matter of acceptance that extends beyond a colonial understanding of who we are. Colourful camp styles have become joyful vehicles to break free from norms, to express ourselves and to show something that otherwise might not have been seen. Whether it be our flora and fauna, queer identity, or the influence of youth, the colours of camp are opportunities to show off our style and share our story.